Okay, we're privileged to have with us Mariah Becker. She is the Director of Research for the and Education at the NCCMP, which is dedicated exclusively to the advocacy and protection of multi-employer plans, their sponsors, participants, and beneficiaries. Prior to joining the NCCMP, Mariah provided actuarial consulting services to single and multi-employer programs for 15 years and spent 10 years with the Siegel Consulting, focusing on a multi-employer defined benefit pension plans. Mariah worked very closely with the NCCMP on review and design and legislation when she was at Siegel. Please welcome Mariah, and we have with us a very new addition, Brian Roseborough, who's in the back of the room. He's from NCCMP, so we look forward to working with you as well. Mariah Becker, thank you.
Thank you. Which button do I want? Okay. So good afternoon. We're running a little bit late today, but I am Mariah Becker. I am, as Robert said, I'm the Director of Research and Education for the NCCMP. I'm really happy to be here with you to speak about this today. First, I want to thank Robert and the Alliance for Retired Americans for inviting the NCCMP to speak with you today on all of the challenges that are facing the multi-employer system. And I think that everybody probably saw, or at least knew about, the hearing that took place yesterday, where Director Reeder of the PBGC spoke before the House Subcommittee on Health, Education, Labor, and Pensions. And in his testimony, he made it pretty clear that the multi-employer system is facing a significant number of challenges right now. So this is an especially timely and important topic. So, what's the NCCMP? The NCCMP is the National Coordinating Committee for Multi-Employer Plans, and as Robert mentioned, we are a nonprofit, nonpartisan organization that was founded in 1974 in response to the establishment of ERISA, and the feeling at the time that the viewpoint of multi-employer plans was not well represented when that was put together. So we are the only organization that's dedicated exclusively to the advocacy and protection of multi-employer pension plans, their sponsors, participants, and beneficiaries. We represent approximately 10.4 million participants throughout the country and every major segment of the economy. We both proactively engage with Congress and the administration, the regulatory agencies and the courts, and we monitor the legal, regulatory, and legal developments from conception to implementation to enforcement, so that we can make sure that the viewpoint of multi-employer plans and their rather unique relationship, both with their participants and how they operate, is reflected and taken into account when all of that is put together. So, as Robert, this is probably a little bit remedial given the audience that we have today, but as Robert mentioned earlier, in the interest of defining terms, what's a multi-employer plan? So a multi-employer plan is a jointly sponsored plan, or sponsored by both employers and the labor, that encompasses everything from large companies to small mom and pop family businesses, that allows them to pool their resources in order to provide retirement security for their benefits. For today, this is not a public plan, this is not a single employer plan, and this is not a 401k defined benefit plan, at least in this instance, although there are definitely some multi-employer 401k plans. All of those kinds of plans have their own separate issues, but we're going to focus almost solely on multi-employer defined benefit pension plans at the moment. They're usually found in industries where workers work for a number of different companies during a career. For example, in the building trades, it's really not uncommon for someone to work for anywhere between 5 and 10 companies in a single year. Multi-employer plans allow that participant to continue to earn a continuous benefit throughout the course of his career, regardless of who he works for, as long as that company participates in the multi-employer defined benefit pension plan. They're jointly managed by a board of both labor and management representatives in equal measure, so that everyone has a voice in how the plan is run. And contributions are generally set by a negotiated collective bargaining agreement that usually extends for somewhere between 3 and 5 years. Once those contributions are set, the employer must make those contributions. And if they do not, they'll be in violation of labor contract law. So keep that in mind, because that's going to become important in a moment. So I forget to move slides. Sorry about that. Quickly, the presentations are on your table, just if anybody wants a copy or in case I forget to move slides again. So over the last year or so, we have been working to put together a system-wide information on the economic impact of multi-employer plans. This type of information is usually critical when Congress is faced with a crisis and is asked to do something about it. So the NCCMP commissioned the National Institute on Retirement Security, NIRS, and Siegel to put together the information on the next 2 pages. So if you look at the total economic output for actives and retired participants in multi-employer pension plans, using the 2005 information just because that was the most recently available. So if you take a look at the economic output, you have $209 billion in economic output that's being driven by multi-employer pension plans. If you look at that over the 10-year budget window, that number gets significantly bigger, and you're up at $7.4 trillion. On taxes, which is something that the government considers when it takes into account how a change might impact its own bottom line, pension plans drive $71 billion in taxes. These are really big numbers, and it gets even bigger once you look at it on the 10-year budget window over which Congress generally evaluates these things. On a 10-year window, that's $749 billion. So these numbers paint a really powerful impact of the retired and active workers that are in multi-employer plans throughout the economy, both in 2015, just the most recently available information, and over the 10-year budget window. You can look at it on a state and local basis as well. These aren't things that the federal government takes into account when they figure out what they want to do, but the state and local governments do consider what that looks like. And the numbers are really tell a pretty similar story. So for 2015, you have $32 billion paid to state and local taxes, and over the 10-year budget window, you have $335 billion. This information really clearly demonstrates what's at risk for everyone if we aren't able to find a solution for multi-employer plans. So this is a really kind of complicated slide, but it is in your presentation. We're going to go through it really pretty quickly, but how did we get here, right? So most multi-employer plans are in good financial health, but there really are a notable few that are in some serious trouble. Of those that are in danger, the vast majority are in trouble as a result of external factors, not internal factors. They're not caused by mismanagement. They're not caused by corruption. It's external factors that are, putting the plans in this tenuous position. It starts with ERISA in 1974. ERISA was introduced new rules that protected participants, but they significantly constrained how pension funds could be managed. They established rules that prohibited changes to benefits that had been earned, regardless of the financial security or stability of the plan. In 1980, the Multi-Employer Pension Plan Amendments Act and the Motor Carriers Act were passed. Both seemed like really good ideas at the time, but ultimately have proven to do more harm than good as time has passed. MEPA introduced the concept of withdrawal liability. It's expanded the employer's obligations to multi-employer plans from the bargain contributions to the liability for benefits both for their employees as well as for the employees of other employers. And the Motor Carrier Act deregulated interstate trucking, which had the unintended consequence of bankrupting a number of companies and reduced the number of people who are participating in certain trucking industry multi-employer plans that are having some trouble now. In 1986, the Tax Reform Act, that was mentioned a little earlier today, introduced a penalty on employers for contributions that were made to a pension plan if the plan was fully funded. During the 90s, the economy was booming. Pension plans were well funded, and they took part in the successes of the market. The problem is that with the Tax Reform Act, they were not allowed to sock this money away as a rainy day fund in case things took a negative turn in the future. For multi-employer plans, where the contributions are collectively bargained and they can't be changed, those contributions would have resulted in huge tax penalties to the employer for making contributions to a pension plan that was fully funded. So plans were forced to increase benefits and avoid those significant tax penalties. Again, this is something that seems like a good thing for participants, but unfortunately those additional benefits have become unsustainable over time for some of those plans. After the 90s, we hit a recession and started in 1999 with a dot-com bust, lasted from right around 2000 to 2002. Plan assets lost somewhere between 15 and 20% of their value. They didn't have that to give because they weren't allowed to build up a cushion during the good years of the 90s. And they they weren't able to protect their participants. So they were doing okay. Plans recovered slowly throughout the early part of the 2000s, thanks both to market improvements and some of the new tools that were introduced as part of the Pension Protection Act. But then they were hit again, both by the financial crisis in 2008 that resulted in losses of somewhere between 20 and 30%, and then the Great Recession that followed that resulted in significant decreases in the man hours worked and the contributions to plan as a result of that. So the requirements of PPA reduced the time that plans had to pay off their obligations from 30 to 15 years. This increased costs and hit the employers that were already struggling under the economy's collapse. And then following the Great Recession, even as the market started to recover, the plans were still struggling because the recession triggered job losses and reduced work hours that meant that the funding for the plans made their recovery lag behind the market. So even as the market's going back up, the plans are lagging because during that down period, they didn't get the contributions that they needed because the man hours just weren't there to support them. For some plans, this was too much. And it started a downward spiral from which they're just not going to be able to recover under the laws that were in effect at the time. In 2014, MEPRA was passed to allow the restructuring of some of these deeply troubled plans that would have otherwise collapsed and resulted in even more severe losses of benefits to participants. But Treasury did not approve some of those applications, and those plans are, again, looking at running out of money. And so a number of the plans that are now struggling are ultimately going to face insolvency within the next few years. So I told you it was kind of a complicated slide, but there's an awful lot of really good information on there. So you probably remember this slide from earlier today as part of Connie's presentation. So she talked about it in quite a bit of detail, so I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on it. But instead, what I'll use it to talk about is that earlier yesterday, as part of the House Cut Subcommittee hearing, Director Reeder addressed the solvency of the Multi-Employer Guarantee Fund at the PBGC. You know, he said they currently have $65 billion in liability. They've got $2 billion in assets, and unfunded liabilities of $65 billion. That's the liability for the approximately 10% of plans that they're expecting to fail within the next 20 years. And this graph was presented in the PBGC's 2015 projections report. There's actually a typo on this slide. I'm really not prescient. So the green mountain is the PBGC's assets, and it shows that they are projected to go to zero, run out of money by 2025, when that mountain is gone. In order to avoid insolvency for 20 years, meaning that the fund is going to be solvent for 20 years and insolvent in the 21st year, essentially kicking the can down the road 20 years. Director Reeder indicated that the premiums would have to increase 5 times. So from their current $28 per participant per year, they'd have to go north of $180 per participant per year in order to keep the fund solvent for 20 years and then run out of money again in the 21st. And just as a reminder, I know that the PBGC talked about this a little bit earlier. That's the amount that's needed to maintain the PBGC's guaranteed level. That is not the amount that's needed to save plans. The PBGC's guaranteed level maxes out at $12,870 at a full career of 30 years of service. That is significantly below most of the benefits that are being played out of our plans right now. So those premiums, you know, almost $200 a participant, are just not economically sustainable for plans or participants or employers. Once the PBGC's fund is exhausted, the PBGC will have to pay benefits from the existing premium income. And also in the hearing yesterday, Tom indicated that when that happens, participants are going to get somewhere around 5% of the benefits that they had been expecting. So 5% of the benefits that they were expecting to receive under their plan. So moving forward, to put some real numbers on what that 5% means, if nothing has changed, this is what we're looking at. So we took this information from the MEPRA applications that have been filed, just because that's where all of the information that you need in order to take a look at something of this depth is. So if you look at the MEPRA applications that are out there, they were expecting to pay, before insolvency, the plans were expecting to pay somewhere on the order of $6 billion in benefits to their participants. Under their MEPRA applications, they would have paid somewhere around $4 billion. That is a heartbreaking and awful reduction. But If those applications are not approved, then you look at the PBGC. At the PBGC level, those same participants would get $2.8 billion. That's a 53% reduction from what they were expecting. But we just talked about the fact that the PBGC is not solvent. When the PBGC goes insolvent, they'll be looking at something more like a 94 to a 98% reduction, which gets you in the neighborhood of 140 million to 350 million in benefit payments to the participants and retirees. So I don't know about you. I sometimes have a hard time thinking in billions and millions. They're gigantic numbers. If you take that down and look at a person, so somebody who's currently making $40,000 a year in retirement. He's age 70. He expects to get that for the rest of his life. It's, it's a decent benefit. Somebody can live on that. So under the MEPRA applications, that person would have got, on average, rough estimate, around $25,600 a year. Again, that is heartbreaking. It's life-altering. That is an awful reduction. When that person, if that MEPRA application doesn't go through, and the plan goes to the PBGC, that person will get a maximum of $12,870 a year when the plan becomes insolvent, assuming he worked a full 30-year career. If he worked less than that, that's not the guarantee. That it's years of service times the guaranteed amount. So it'll be ratioed down by years of service. Once the PBGC goes insolvent, that $12,870 a year, which is already really pretty minimal. It's a very low guarantee, significantly lower than the guarantee on the PBGC fund. The $12,870 a year becomes $643 to $1,609 a year. That's $54, or somewhere between $54 and $134 a month. Life altering doesn't even begin to cover what we're facing if we aren't able to find a solution for the multi-employer problems that we have right now. So one of the things that has been talked about as we try to figure out what we can do about this problem is a federal loan program. And as Phil mentioned earlier today, that is something that comes up often. There's a number of different proposals out there. I'm sure everybody is aware of which ones they are. The two most important things you want to remember about federal loan programs are the first two bullets on this page. Federal credit programs are really hard to get passed. Not saying it's impossible, but it's very hard. Once they get passed, they're even harder to get the executive branch to implement them. They don't want to, they don't like it. OMB and Treasury very rarely support federal credit programs. OMB's opinion is particularly important because under the Federal Credit Reform Act of 1990, or FCRA, OMB is responsible for everything having to do with federal credit, both how a loan program is scored and whether or not a loan is made. So just as some background, the cost of all federal credit programs has to be calculated under the Federal Credit Reform Act, not under the CBO 10-year budget window. This has been the case for every single federal credit program that has been put in place since FCRA was passed in 1990. By the way, that includes TARP, right? That was passed in the fall of 2008 as the economy is facing collapse and the government is considering whether or not to bail out the banks in order to prop up the economy so that everything doesn't fall apart the next year. TARP was passed under FCRA. It's a very important scheme to keep in mind as we think about how this is going to work going forward. Under FCRA, the cost of a program has to be calculated as something called a credit subsidy. So rather than looking at the 10-year budget window, that looks at all of the government's cash outflows and inflows over the entire course of the loan. So it's not a 10-year calculation. If it's a 30-year loan, it's a 30-year calculation. If it's a 45-year loan, it's a 45-year calculation. Those cash flows are adjusted for defaults. They're adjusted for how the government thinks that a plan may or may not pay back the loan that's coming. And it's discounted using the government's cost of credit. Each loan that would be made under any kind of loan program, because this program would be so big, our problem is very big, would be scored independently. So every plan that would apply for a loan would have to apply and be scored by itself. So the appropriation that the government would put on its books is a dollar amount, but the credit subsidy is expressed as a percentage of the loan. So just throwing numbers out there, we've taken a look at what some of the programs that are out there might be, and our guesstimates of what those credit subsidies might be are on the order of 60 to 70%. So even if Congress passes a loan program with a credit subsidy that looks like that, high credit subsidy programs really don't usually get implemented. Just as a point of reference, in 2017, the average credit subsidy rate for all programs was a minus 1.1. So a negative credit subsidy rate means that a loan program earns money for the government. So this program is really expensive. Just because the interest rate subsidy that's implicit in a loan from the Treasury at a rate less than what they would charge is, it already costs the government money. So as Tom mentioned yesterday, at this point, all of the options that are available to the government are not good. They're not going to like any of the options that are out there. Everything involves some kind of awfulness for somebody. It's either the government in the form of the credit subsidy from the loan program, although the way that one structures that program can help to alleviate some of the concerns that they have. It's the participants, which is awful for everyone involved. It's the employers, which some of them can't handle it, and if it happens to them, will drive them out of business, which has its own cascading effects. But every plan that is possible to keep solvent under any kind of loan program like this is one fewer plan that will hit the PBGC's books, and that's important. So, looking forward. So as Phil mentioned earlier, there are three different programs or three different loan proposals out there. So I'm just going to close by throwing out a whole bunch of questions for you to think about as you think about how we might approach something like a loan program or a way to address the multi-employer crisis that we're staring down. First, has the program been evaluated under the Federal Credit Reform Act? It's an important thing. All federal credit programs have to be evaluated under it. Don't forget, the credit subsidy is the relevant measure, not the 10-year budget window. And minus 1.1 is the average credit subsidy rate for the government's $3.5 trillion in loans that they have outstanding right now. So that's sort of the basis on which OMB and the government is going to evaluate this thing. How much does the program lend? And when is the money actually given out to plans? Does that work? Does that make sense, given that we're trying to let plans have the money at a lower interest rate and arbitrage their way between the money that the government is willing to lend them and the returns that they're hoping to get in the market? Is the way that the money is given to plans, does it make sense? Does it allow them to do that? What rates of return are being used to demonstrate to the government that that loan will both make the plan solvent and will allow the plan to repay the money to the government? Are the people at OMB and Treasury who are going to look at this and consider that and decide whether or not to make that loan, are they going to think that those rates of return are reasonable? If they don't, what does that mean for whether a loan's ever actually going to get made? There we go. So every loan that might be considered under this is going to fundamentally be really expensive. Who is going to pay the credit subsidy cost? Is it going to be the government? Is it going to be the borrowing plan? How are they going to do that? Do they share the cost between them somehow? Does the proposal try and share the cost across the entire multi-employer community? How does who is paying for that cost impact who's going to support any kind of proposal like that, both on the Hill and throughout the community? How is the loan structured? Is it structured in such a way that's going to work for or against support by OMB and the executive branch? These are really hard questions. I'm not actually offering any answers. There aren't any easy answers. Loan programs it's an arcane science, and they're incredibly complicated. But I do want to paraphrase a really great analogy that somebody told me yesterday. You don't buy a car without kicking the tires and checking under the hood. You got to make sure you understand what you're buying. The absolute worst thing that could happen to us, the multi-employer community, is that we buy what we think is a good car, and it's a lemon as soon as we drive off the lot. With that, I'll open it up to your questions. Thanks. Yep.
Did you get any sense during that hearing yesterday that members on that committee were interested in doing whatever was necessary to prevent the PBGC from becoming insolvent?
So the hearing to me yesterday was very interesting for a number of different reasons. So I did see some support out there for kinds of proposals that would prop up the multi-employer system. I heard at least two different congresswomen mentioning the loan proposal that's out there, the Brown-Neal bill. That's the one that's out there so far as an introduced bill, and urging their compatriots to consider it. That being said, I think the biggest thing that I took away from that hearing is the amount of education that we need to do with the people on the Hill, because it was not clear to me that everyone necessarily understood that there are at least two very big problems facing the multi-employer system right now. The first is we have a number of plans that are headed towards insolvency. There's, the PBGC's estimates puts it at north of 100 plans that are facing insolvency over the next 20 years. The second problem is that the PBGC is facing insolvency. These are both very big problems. They are both problems that affect the multi-employer system, but they are interconnected, but they are not the same. So a proposal that saves the PBGC and preserves the multi-employer guarantee fund doesn't necessarily save a plan itself, right? Because as we saw on the slide before, the PBGC guaranteed level is very low for multi-employer plans. So a plan like Central States, when its benefits hit the PBGC, they're going to take significant reductions in the benefits that they were expecting to get, far more than were part of the MEPRA applications. So just having that out there as a bar. If the PBGC is saved, but nothing is done for the plans themselves, the Central States participants and others in plans like them are facing very significant reductions in benefits beyond what they've even contemplated so far. Okay.
Thank you.
Nope.
Are there any other examples on the federal credit loan?
Are there any other examples of federal credit loans that are kind of applicable in this area where you've had beneficiaries that need to be paid out, so a large amount of the money has to come up front, something like that?
So this, I think, would be one of the larger programs that has been contemplated. I don't know that I can point you to any other specific programs that would be structured much like this. I may make our newest NCCMP member in the back there speak up, as he has far more experience in this area than I do.
Thank you, Mariah.
You're welcome. I'm so glad you could join us.
Previously did a state treasury.
Wait a minute.
Yeah.
Thank you. I previously did a stint at the Treasury Department, 01 to 04, and there we dealt with the airline loan guarantee board. Previous to that, and previous to our term, there was a steel board. There were other programs set up that didn't get utilized because of the cost. There was a local TV board that was set up to get internet service in rural America, these type of things. But no, none of those compared in magnitude to the numbers that would be necessary to provide a sufficient loan guarantee program, or a loan program, what's being talked about now. And again, having sat in the Treasury chair before, as Mariah indicated, OMB, Treasury and Administration Executive Branch, with programs like this, anything that is coming for the general fund and money, you're starting at the position of no. You're starting at the position of the constituents, the taxpayers, the tax funds, and an environment where the deficits have continued to increase. It is a very real problem. And unfortunately, as happened in the case of TARP in 2008, sometimes you only get a decision made at the point of crisis, and you don't get the best decisions made when you're making the decisions under those circumstances.
Thanks, Brian. I told you he could give you a more definitive answer than I could. Anything else? Oh.
Well, this would be a follow-up question. Looking at the data on your slides about the kind of the leveraging effect of pension payments, taxes,
Yep.
I assume spending, how does that factor into this analysis?
Yeah, no, so that's a good question. And I mean,
Quite
that aspect of it has been a heightened debate just in overall government finances the last 20 years since supply side economics came in, and whether that just should be remain static or dynamic scoring is basically what we're talking about. And it has to be a consideration. And again, my reference to hearing yesterday and the question about whether or not the committee was attuned to how serious this was and how it affected their districts and the underlying economics. And yes, they are, but again, because of whether it's the inconsistency in how dynamic scoring is looked at and viewed, and a consensus on that, it's generally hard to get people to accept that. They're more comfortable with a static dynamic CBO scoring situation. But again, as Mariah has emphasized here, the magnitude of this, though, is so significant. I think that is starting to come across now where people get, look, this is just big. And again, coupling it with the governments, one of the biggest challenges overall is retirement savings. When I first came to Washington in 2001, I was talked into it because we were going to do Social Security reform and save Social Security. I arrived, it was confirmed in July of 2001. We had one meeting, then 9/11 happened and changed the whole agenda of what we were going to do. There weren't surpluses, there were deficits, and it changed everything. But they not only linked with this, but whole Social Security, Medicare, and just all retirement savings is a big issue that has been kicked down the road continually, and it's going to have to be embraced. And maybe this will be the issue that kind of forces it sooner rather than later before there is the bigger overall crisis.